Good morning. This is Jamie Brand again here with 360 Yield Center. We just wanted to share some information. I've pulled a lot of tests here already this spring, and I've pulled a lot of tests here over the last several years, and just wanted to share to you what I'm finding this year, and just as we start thinking about this crop that's starting to emerge. So the topic for today is understanding early nitrogen tests and placement, as you will see here on the screen. And as we start to see this crop emerge, it leads us to the question of, what is underneath these tires on this four-wheeler? We see the plants that we're straddling. We see the tires running over the residue that the row cleaners pushed up. And the question is do we have nitrogen down? When did we put that nitrogen down? And, what have we got established? And so there's a lot of different ways that we can apply nitrogen, a lot of different years that nitrogen feels from the time of application to the time of emergence of the crop. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. So went out this spring, and I've done this for 4 years now, and this is the driest year, I think probably the driest year of a spring that I've ever had pulling these samples. Typically, so I want you to keep that as we're talking about this. Each year is very different, and I'll allude to that as we're going through this. And I think that's what's good to know. It's soil sampling and measuring is about trying to get yourself within a rate range for application, but I think more than that, it's about trying to understand how efficient is what I'm doing? How efficient is it in a dry year? How efficient it is in a wet year? And, what's the likelihood of the money that a farmer spends is going to get into the corn plant? And we'll talk a little bit more about that today. So really, when I look at sampling here, it's all about banking data points to help us build a bigger picture in the future. It helps us understand where that nitrogen is, not only whether it's in the 0 to 12, whether it's in the 12 to 24, how wide is it from the band. So what you'll see here in the picture in a lot of these samples, you'll see basically where the nitrogen has been applied with the strip. You'll see the board laid down, and we're putting taking samples out of each one of those holes. So this is after I'm done. So basically what I've done here is hole number 1, which would be the far left. I'm going down that hole, getting a 12-inch core, 0 to 12, and then I'm jumping 4 inches ahead, doing a 0 to 12. I'm dumping those 2 cores into a bag, which is B1. Then I'm going down those exact same holes and getting a 12 to 24 out of both of those. So basically 2 sets of cores go into each one. That's why you see more holes than what the board has. So as we're going through these samples, start to visualize where the product was applied, where it's at today, how deep it is, how wide it got. And so that's what we want to focus on here for just a little bit. So again, the reason for this picture is this is a great data point for us to look at, because we're going to look at product that was stabilized, and we're going to look at product that was not stabilized from fall application. And we know that those stabilizers aren't designed to add yield necessarily. They're designed to protect from the loss of something we've applied due to the environment that allows that nutrient to be there when the plant needs it versus loss. So we're going to look at those two things a little bit today. This isn't designed to be is stabilizer right or stabilizer wrong. I think it's the design that what we're starting to look at year in, year out. So it was interesting the other day, Greg Souter did a presentation for us or did a yield minute and it was posted on social media. And we always think of knowledge as power, but I would agree with Greg, knowledge is really profit. Whether it's the planter that you choose to run and the reasons why you make those decisions with that planter, great, incredible planting technology on the market today. I mean, just incredible. And that has been driven by knowledge. We're driving right now the nutrients that are feeding those plants to drive profits and knowledge. And so that's really what we want to talk about today when we start talking about what these plants need and why we do the things that we do. So one of the many questions that we get is, how much nitrogen does it take to raise a bushel of corn? And for years and years and years of being in ag retail, we would do that prepay, and we would sit there and we'd say, well, how much do you want to put on your corn on corn? How much do you want to put on your soybeans? Usually it was 20 to 30 pounds more for corn on corn, might be 180 for corn on corn, might be 150. And we would use that 1.2 or 1.1, and typically we'd get more yield than the 1.1 or 1.2, which was always confusing to me. But as we've learned more about nitrogen and we've read a lot more, certainly the soil is very powerful and it can bring us a lot of nitrogen. And so in the true statement, this is just an article that Ken Ferry did here. I got it off of AgWeb. Is that really, if we want to be true to ourselves and we really want to know what that plant and that root system is going to pull, it's going to pull up to 1.6 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. So we certainly don't apply that much. You know, there's a farmer applied nitrogen, there's a soil given nitrogen. And we see that time and time and time again. We can control both of those things, quite honestly. We can control soil given nitrogen by drainage, by pH, by organic matter, by just plain soil health. The ability for that soil to work, no different than a human body, to release nitrogen. The part that we can control on the farmer side is, where do we put it, when do we put it on, and what is the likelihood of those pounds that we apply that are actually going to get into the plant. Now, there's no question that farmer applied nitrogen, no matter how you apply it, there's going to be a percentage that get into the plant. But the question is, what is that percentage? And that's what I want to talk a little bit about today. So you guys have seen this many, many times. And we're going to look at some corn plants here in just a minute, and we're going to start visualizing this, is that we really start to ramp up nitrogen need later in the season. And predominantly early on, a lot of that nitrogen is probably weighed towards farmer given, some soil given. And as we go into that V10, V14, it's a combination of both. And our best plan of attack is to be able to have soil that gives nitrogen and farmer applied nitrogen that's available, so that they can work in combination to make sure that you're producing the yield that you want to produce. And you'll see in that bottom left there, those ears of corn. You know, typically if we're wanting to push for 300 bushel corn down the road, and I know that depending on who's on the call here this morning, you might say, well, that's just not for me. Currently, we got a long ways to go to get there. In some situations, we've gotten there. In some situations, we're getting close. But, you know, at today's planting populations, we've been able to achieve that at some degree, you know, at getting roughly 700 kernels per ear. You may be getting closer to 560 kernels per ear with the driver to get more. It certainly depends a little bit on the ear type, but the ability to generate weight on each plant can make a significant difference when it comes to yield. So the thing I want to share with you today is, where is our nitrogen at today? We're in the field that has not received farmer applied nitrogen. What are our levels? And areas of the field that have received farmer applied nitrogen, where are those levels? So this is nitrate. This is NO3, negative form that certainly is mobile, strongly mobile within the soil, moved by soil moisture. So this field that you're seeing here on the screen, a snapshot up in the upper left corner, is strip tilled. So this plant's a pretty happy plant. It's sitting there saying, you know what? I don't have to look to my left. I don't have to look to my right. My nitrogen load is predominantly below me. And this could feel very different if you did it at an angle. If you work the ground, don't really know where those are, and those plants are. So basically, when we're looking at this and you're looking at laying that board down, the center of the row, there's roughly about 11 pounds per acre. In the top 12, around 11 in the bottom 12. So that to me is just the soil starting to give back. It's that tug of war between soil microbes needing that nitrate and the ability for it to be left in the soil for the plant. Also, you'll see in the center here, that's where that knife mark went. And you'll see the 0 to 12, you'll see those rates there, certainly very high. The concerning rate to always me is the 12 to 24. So I always picture this corn plant and the seedling just 2 inches below the ground, radicals starting to come out, and we're already 12 inches away with that nitrogen with a downward movement. So these are numbers that drive the efficiency. This is the number that drives, is that going to be there when the plant actually needs the majority of the horsepower of the nitrogen? So we're sitting here, these samples were pulled 4/28, 28th of April here. And so that's what you can kind of see where we're at. The question is where is, the big question is you stabilize this, so where's my ammonium levels? So when we start looking at ammonium levels, you can see that that comes out of that knife, it hits moisture and it becomes very sticky and it sticks right where it's at. So you're going to see the ammonium portion of this at 87 pounds per acre right in the slot. Certainly not moving out very much. You can see that there's really not much ammonium in the what you would call soil residual or throughout the profile where we didn't make the application point. So that's kind of where we sit in a year that's a little bit drier with a product that was placed in the fall with a technology that is designed to protect it, into the spring in a form that is less mobile for a longer period of time. So this screen here is no stabilizer. So certainly, again, this is not a conversation about should I use stabilizer or not. This is one question we always get is when we pull samples, the first hand will go up and say, well, they should have used stabilizer, or did they use stabilizer? So it's important for us to have the whole puzzle here. So this is non-stabilized, and you will see that the rates are higher in the nitrate form. I will tell you that years where we've had more rain, we have a significant more in the 12 to 24 than we do this year. And the reason for that is this is the driest year we've had in a long time from application to this polling. Now, this is a particular spot in Iowa. Many of you will disagree with that depending on your geography this year. So when you start looking at how tight those are, you start looking at that board and you start thinking about, what if I planted my plant in hole number 1 instead of hole number 5? How would that plant feel differently? And so we're starting to learn about, that's a placement conversation, but it's really more of an efficiency conversation. With all the technology that we have today and the ability to do things better than we've ever done, and I look at this planter strip and I just see these plants and what planters are able to do, the general tendency is then to move to how can we place our nutrients better within that and understand where they're at. So next slide is no stabilizer. Now, if you remember back to the one with NServe, that 15 pounds per acre was 87. So, significantly, it had done its job of keeping more of that product in ammonium form longer. So another question we often get is, so at what point do we feel, whether it's stabilized or unstabilized, that if we're just sending in nitrate samples instead of nitrate and ammonium samples, at what point do we think that our applied fall nitrogen is in nitrate form? And I would say typically by about May 15th or May 20th, historically it's going to be, whether it's stabilized or not, it's going to be pretty much converted. And so that's kind of been a track record of about 4 years with a variety of different environments, a variety of different soil temperatures. So I think that's probably a pretty fair place to be when we start thinking about that. So those are some of the early samples that we pulled. And again, this is not necessarily designed to drive what our rate is going to be. It's just designed to understand where it is in the profile and, is it where we hoped it would be based on what we need it to do for the corn plant. There's always this tug of war between what the corn plant is screaming for. And as we look at these corn plants, it's planted incredibly high yield potential. In some cases, it's carrying some type of a trait to fend off something that would take away its yield. It's probably carrying some type of a trait that allows us to spray certain types of herbicide over it. And it's sitting there and saying, you know what, I will do everything that in my power that I can do for you if you just make sure you keep me free from diseases and you keep me free from a nutrient deficiency. And so that's really the driver of what we want to talk about more today. So as this plant starts out, and the picture there on the left is actually one of the plants that came out of this field. You can see right here is the radical. You know, right here is the seminal roots, which is basically an anchor, and it's predominantly living off the seed right now. And so for the most part, the majority of everything is coming from the seed. You'll see right here is the crown, which eventually will start delivering out roots, which will be the nodal roots. So as that plant will progress, we'll see a longer radical. We'll see those seminal roots keep out, which is basically an anchor. And we're going to start to see that first nodal root come out, which is going to be the predominant feeders. And here we're at V1, which we're still living off the seed. V2 here is when we start to see the crown of the plant, which was right here, is now looking like this. And now all these roots right here are starting to support the plant and do the things that that plant wants to do. And so that's when we start seeing that nitrogen uptake, that sulfur, the phosphorus, and all the things like that. So as we start looking at placement and starting to look at everything that goes with understanding that corn plant and the placement and the nitrogen and where is the nitrogen and how deep is the nitrogen, those are things that we want to think about. So this is just the progression. So this is a field that on the left here that we would typically be side dressing. Maybe at this point, this field could have nitrogen placed right underneath the plant. It could have nitrogen if it was fall applied at an angle. It could have planter applied nitrogen that's put right in the zone. It could have 32% that was blown over the top by a floater. And so you've got to start thinking about how are we going to best represent this corn plant. And then as we look over here, we start seeing this. This is a plant that is tasseled, and we can just start seeing this, just the mass of this root system continue to grow. And the question is where is it going to get its water and where is it going to get its nutrients? And so we just want to start to think about when we're measuring for nitrogen, which is really what this webinar is about, we need to start thinking about, is it where we intended it to be, and is it where we most likely want to get up the plant? So the question is can I adjust my rate if I place it differently? So if we look back at this picture, and this happens to be a picture, the way I visualize this is this was strip tilled with fall anhydrous, and this is where those samples came from. But think about any application that you may have on this. It could be a broadcast where you're trying to charge the whole profile. It could be planter nitrogen that's placed 2 by 2. It could be bandit nitrogen that's placed about 3/4 of an inch down, 2.5 inches off the seed that's going to bleed over those nodal roots. But that plant is going to have an opinion of how you apply that nitrogen. And you're going to have to somehow come in and make a difference. And so based on how you do this, does it affect your rate? So right here are 2 syringes. It reminds me of my days back growing up with livestock. The question is how much nitrogen does a corn plant need? And so when we start thinking about this, and I do a lot of math and I try to understand how much, when I look at that one seed, how much water does that thing need to uptake? And quite honestly, when we look at major nutrients, how much nitrogen does that thing need to uptake? We see all these bullets and these huge UAN tanks and these huge dry sheds, and we just think massive amounts of nitrogen. And we do take a lot, but when we start to zero in and we start thinking about we want each plant to contribute, what is the appetite for each plant? So if we're going to go out and we're going to raise 220 bushel corn in 30-inch rows at 34,000, let's just say that that's our recipe for planting on this particular situation. If we go out and we use certain certain methods that maybe are less efficient, and we're trying to drive both yield and efficiency. And we say, I want to put on 1.1 pounds of nitrogen per bushel that I intend, or my yield goal. And that's the farmer applied method in this scenario. We're going to need to put on roughly about 242 pounds of nitrogen, if that's where we want to go. And in that situation, we are going to apply about 8.24 cc's per plant. So that's the full load that plant is going to need roughly from a farmer applied nitrogen standpoint. It's going to need more nitrogen as far as soil applied, but that's about what you're going to have to put on there, because part of that 32% in that syringe is going to be inefficient. It's not going to get in the plant. It maybe was applied earlier, got too far down, maybe denitrified or something like that. So our driver is to measure, understand where it's at, multiple applications, and can that syringe be less? There's a dollar amount with each syringe there. There's certainly a dollar amount with different applications as well, but we tend to blow that away when we start thinking about just savings and potential yield. So can we, instead of putting on 242 pounds of N with a 220 bushel yield goal, can we put on 176 pounds and be more attentive about putting it where the plant needs it, be more attentive of putting it within the zone of the majority of the root mass, and do the things that we want to do? So that's just one visualization of can we drive efficiency by placement. And the way we know placement is by those early, a lot of the data that we can learn about placement is by just measuring and understanding where nitrogen moves. Secondary, we can help zone in a rate. So this is the marks. You can see the marks here of where I put a syringe right here of just that placement of, whether that placement might be there. It could be a variety of different ways that we focus on this area right here, that eventually, if we go out and this stuff is waist tall, or this stuff is head tall, or this stuff is at R1, that's basically where I'm going to put my spade. I'm going to put my spade on that outside yellow mark, and I'm going to dig down, and I'm going to look for the massiveness of the root system. I'm going to look if it's white, I'm going to look if it's robust, and I'm going to look if it's wet. And that's the driver for the majority of the uptake of both water and nutrients. When we start looking about what it could to make that seedling turn into a corn plant that's going to deliver the yield that we want it to hopefully deliver. So when we start thinking about this, so this is just a visualization slide. So, it's hard to always see syringes. It's hard to always understand exactly what is going. But, we get a lot of questions about post-urea or coulter in the center of the row versus Y drop. And, how much does that matter? How much does it not matter? And so on the left, I measured out what it would take if we just used urea to feed that plant. And this is that 220 bushel yield goal. Again, I'm putting on around a pound per bushel, and that's what the visual of what it would look like on the left. That's the clump of what that plant would need to absorb down through the root system season long, a farmer applied for it to produce high yielding corn without a nutrient deficiency. When we start looking at the left, when we start looking at that broadcast idea, now we're starting to blow it all over the entire field. And we're starting to charge the entire field with the assumption that we're more in a situation where we're not planted in rows. And so it just continues to drive that efficiency factor of, is there a better way to do it? And I keep going back to planter technology because I'm always amazed at what our planters can do today. We know exactly where the seed's at. For the most part, we know exactly how deep it is. We've covered it up, we've pinched it, we've put it in there, we seed to soil contact, everything that we've started out so wonderfully. And can we just take the next step to that nutrient management? So the other part of this is when we look at measuring and managing, if we go out to a field, and I'll show you one here in just a little bit, we inevitably, when we measure this throughout the growing season, the lowest amount of nitrogen that we pull out of the holes is in the row. And people will say, well, how is that possible? You know, when we start thinking about we've applied nitrogen, our hope is to have the highest amount of nitrogen in the row or near the row because it can uptake it. Well, the truth is that's where the majority of the pull comes from. And so that's where, you know, the hose is coming out of the tank and it's sucking it down the hardest. It's also where the majority of the water comes in. And so as we start looking at this, you know, we start looking at what the corn plant would say to you if it could talk. And it would say, I think I'm a selfish corn plant. You didn't put me out here to mess around. You put me out here to produce yield. And so you can start to see here as I grab my pen again, as we come along here, we can start seeing what that plant is saying. And as you get height on the corn plant, what it can control how it funnels water. It can't control where the nutrients get put, but it can control how it funnels water. And it knows it needs a massive amount of water. Each one of these seedlings, if we're talking about 5 to 8 cc's of farmer applied nitrogen, you know, we're talking in the upwards of probably 30 gallons of water, maybe more. I don't think anybody really knows how much water a corn plant does because it's hard to, we can say we had 21 inches and we didn't have 21 inches in the rain gauge. Roughly 8 times of that, as that plant gets bigger, funnels itself to the base. So we know that it's probably in the 30 to 40 gallons of water that could go up each one of these root systems each year. And the corn plant, without the funneling effect, we would have probably, you know, drought conditions probably every year because of just exactly what it's doing. And I think there's still a lot of research for us to do on that, and 360 is dedicated to doing that. So this is a slide that each of you have seen, I'm sure. This is just nuclear N studies from the University of Illinois. Just validates that there are different methods to get nutrients in. And the way we do this and know this is by getting into the corn plant, understanding what it's expressing. Again, it starts with that early measuring and those data points that you can start to pull and start to understand why these results are what they are. So again, as we start looking at different things, you know, can we get more nitrogen in? Can we get more yield potential? And we certainly have seen that at this point. And so the one thing I don't want to miss out on is just that sulfur piece. Sulfur is a very important piece of this nitrogen and what nitrogen does, and certainly another protein source. And we certainly want to keep those things in mind as we go. So one last sampling that I want to share here with you today is there's going to be decisions that are going to be made here. Corn is coming up. Side dressers are going to come out with either coulters. Post-urea machines could be coming out. Hopefully a lot of Y drops will be coming out. We've had a great year with converting Y drop side dress from coulters with just that yield advantage that we've seen over the last 3 years. And so this is what we're going to see, and it's been the same for 4 years, and I suspect that it's going to be the same for the next 40 years. Nitrogen does not move much. It does not move side to side much. It moves predominantly down. It converts, and then it's just the path of least resistance and just natural gravity as it moves down. So as we look at this was applied here. This was 100 pounds of fall NH3 with 40 pounds of weed and feed and 80 pounds of UAN with coulter bar. And you'll see my flag in there. You'll see my bags. The coulter obviously went down the center of the row. Again, an early measurement helps us validate not only where to put it, but also starts to give us the real world about what that rate needs to be. And so you'll see that the significant amount of that nitrogen 4 weeks after application is in the 12 to 24 in the center of the row. So just another snapshot of just understanding exactly what we're learning from these early measurements and just the value of placement. So this is just an ROI on side dress. This is strictly just a placement, strictly placement. No change in rate, really no change in timing. It's just strictly being intensive of trying to put it closer to the corn plant. And over the last 3 years, we've seen about 6 bushel. And so we're seeing a very high rate of return which has led us to now, the thing I want to get a point today is measurement is incredibly important. But I think most people want to run out and measure to come up with a rate so that they can go apply the next day. And measurement can certainly help us do that. But measurement, I think the value of measurement can be much greater than that as we dig deeper and start to understand not necessarily where it is, but why is it where it is. And if we keep doing it maybe the way we've done it, we're going to continue to have the same result. Now, the way we've done it might be very good, and it validates why we're doing it that way. The way we've done it might be something that we're saying, boy, there's too much risk associated with what we're doing. So this here is my pretty much my last slide. And if you guys have heard me talk before, it probably does not surprise you that this is up there. I believe strongly, very strongly, that our push for nitrogen in the future is going to be variable rate. We see areas of our field that we know we have the data, farmers have the data, ag retailers have the data, consultants have the data that shows the difference in organic matter, in soil type, in previous yield history. We can go out and measure, and we can see significant different levels in different parts of the field of nitrogen. And it's just the opposite of what most people would think. Higher yielding areas of the field tend to be higher yielding because the soil is more giving. Lower part of the fields tend to be less giving, lower organic matter, tighter soils, worse drainage. And so whether you make these decisions today in 2018 or whether you make it in 2019 or 2020, this whole measurement, this whole placement, this whole management are all tools to get us to better management long term when it comes to be able to managing these entire fields. So with that, thank you very much and have a safe rest of your spring, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.